Elizabeth talks about that she and I have gone back quite a while now, which is absolutely true. But I should also take the moment to acknowledge there are various people in the room with who I go back farther than that even. And the person I wanted to most particularly is Dr. Christopher Donnan, who, when I arrived at graduate school in UCLA in 1985, he was the first person that helped me along the way to my career. So I'm delighted to see you here, Chris, and I'm very grateful for lots. Well, as you could probably intuit from my CV, that my little bio that Elizabeth read, I'm not trained as a historian. I'm trained as an archaeologist. But one of the things that happened to me along the way is I needed to retool. So I finished my degree in 1994, and there was very little work to be had at that point. And I was, like lots of people in our career, I was sort of scrambling to find a little something to grab onto so I could survive long enough to get into academia, which is what I wanted to do. And I'd had this long interest in history, particularly the history of archaeology, and particularly in the American Southwest. I grew up in Santa Fe. By the way, those of you who know Santa Fe, this is Santa Fe in 1915 probably. This is just for points of reference. If anyone's ever been to the Cross of the Martyrs in Santa Fe on Fort Marcy, that's that right there. This is a little look at Santa Fe. The ruins in the foreground are an old Spanish colonial era fortification that were really guarding the northern entrances into town. So we're only a 7-minute walk from the plaza in this place right now. Now it's under houses. You'd never know it's there. But this is Santa Fe. This is where I grew up. I grew up in this environment. And I was interested in the stories of people who were archaeologists in Santa Fe who I had not been able to learn about in graduate school. Not because they didn't exist, but because the kind of emphasis that was placed upon what we're supposed to learn and the history that we're supposed to know didn't include them. And my thought at the time was, why is that? Why is so-and-so and not so-and-so talked about in graduate seminars when they were both out there at the same time? And there's a lot of reasons for that, but because I grew up in Santa Fe, lots of those people who I knew about a little bit from even middle school field trips and things. You'd go to a place, you go to the museum, you do this, you do that. You'd hear a lot about people like Edgar Lee Hewitt. Edgar Lee Hewitt, famous Southwestern archaeologist, turn of the century, is a footnote today in most of the curricula that anthropologists look at for a lot of reasons. And I thought, well, why? So in the process of trying to find a way to kind of stay alive in the field in the middle 90s, and I got involved in some historical research, and I found money, ironically, I was more viable as a historian of archaeology for a period of time than I was as an archaeologist. So I wasn't trained. I was just going to archives and doing things. So I spent years working on this subject. This is someone who I met on that journey. This is the kind of photograph that one might take as a tourist in those days in Santa Fe in about 1915. This is a photograph that's a little different. That's her, same person, Ethelyn Hobbs Field Nelson. In this guy, she is the spouse of the archaeologist Nels Nelson, who I was interested in. I'm studying Nels. If anyone wants to talk about Nels Nelson, I'd be happy to, but that's another story. But he was one of the people in my broader canvas here. But there was Ethelyn Nelson, who had been, among other things, the secretary of Alfred Kroeber at Berkeley. When Nelson met her, and they and fairly in their 40s, they got married and went off, and she lived an archaeological life with him. But that is really all we know about Ethelyn Nelson, is that she was the secretary of Kroeber, and she was married to Nelson, and that's all. I don't know who Field was. She was a divorcee. We don't know anything about that. I've looked at Berkeley. Not a lot about her at Berkeley. She's invisible in that way. Names, general outlines. I know more about Ethelyn than anybody on the planet, and I know nothing at all about her, but this photograph, as far as I know, and people, please, correct me, because I'm happy to be amended in this case, is the first photograph of a woman in the Southwest actually digging as an archaeologist. There are lots of women who are involved in anthropology and archaeology in various kind of ways. We'll talk about some of them. But here she is. She's got dirt on the knees of her skirt here. She's digging. And I thought, well, does that deserve some commendation? Maybe. But the more important role is nobody knows her. Nobody knows her for a lot of reasons. And that's a story that I think will be very, very hard to tell. There's not much of a trail for Ethel Nelson. But she's emblematic in some ways of women that I'm going to be talking about tonight, but also, and I'm going to be a little self-critical here, women that I didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about when I went through this project back in the 90s. So we'll proceed there. Some people might think...
Pardon me.
Yeah.
What's the building in the right upper corner?
What is that building? Oh, that's this is the archaeological site of Tonquay, which is between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. So if people who know this area, there's a casino at San Felipe, kind of halfway in between. Tonquay is about 7 kilometers from the highway up to the west. Happy to tell you where it is if you ever want to go and see it. Interesting site, poorly understood, big site, but Tonquay was famous for making pottery. And the clay sources there were not only famous for them, they were famous later. So this is a brick kiln from the late 19th century. And there are around Santa Fe, Albuquerque, you could get bricks, old construction bricks that are stamped Tonquay on it. And that's like a little, it's one of those little archaeological souvenirs. They go, well, I've got a Tonquay brick, right? What geeks we are, in that way. Okay, but you might also think that, all right, if you know a little bit about Southwest archaeology, there are a lot of women who achieved extraordinary things and have been widely acknowledged in that field. Cynthia Irwin-Williams on the right, very, very famous, principally working on older basket maker, Paleo-Indian stuff, excavated at Salmon Pueblo. In particular, Linda Cordell, who's a mentor of mine, who has only recently passed away. A member of the National Academy of Science, someone with a serious heft and serious acknowledgement. And one could say, well, look, there are a lot of women that we talk about in the Southwest. So it's not, Barbara Mills is a famous one who's now the chair of anthropology at the University of Arizona. It's an area that has traditionally been thought of as relatively open to women. There's this phrase, daughters of the desert, that was popularized in the 90s by some other historians who talked about these folks in a lot of different kinds of ways, past and present. There's a long history here. So then the question is, well, they're not unknown. We have known. So if you're going to pick a part of the world where women are known and contribute and are acknowledged, why do you pick this one? Well, this is true going way back. Frances Densmore, not an archaeologist, but an anthropologist, did lots of interesting things with linguistics. That's a kind of a famous photograph, which I always like. The one that we talk about here, because she was one of the people involved with the Rainbow Ridge Monument Valley expedition, is Anna Shepard in the 1930s, who was a real pioneer in the analysis of ceramics in archaeology, kind of remarkable individual, both of them, and there are others of their generations, right? So you think, well, okay, so they're not lost, they're not forgotten. Well, I am the product of all this work, and was a book that was published in 2001, was called Ruins and Rivals. I did lots of work in regional archives all around the Southwest. This is, of course, the Mount Washington campus of the Autry of the Southwest Museum. Spent a lot of time in these archives, collected a lot of notes, and effectively put it away in about 2002. Went off into other kind of things. Went back into field archaeology, a lot of stuff there, and because by that time I was employed and I could go back to archaeology. And just as a little aside, those guys, this is at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, they didn't care what I did so long as I was going to get tenure and not embarrass them. So the fact that I had a book ready to go, which was this book, check, do what you want. And I said, well, I want to go back to do some archaeology, fine. So all the stuff that Elizabeth was talking about, the paths and trails and that kind of thing, launched from this point. And I've done other historic projects since, but never on this aspect of the American Southwest. I said, well, I thought I've done that. I've written this book up. We talk about, I was interested in competition and institutions and various kinds of narratives that I constructed. So fine, and I still am, but that project was done. But like most of these things, and I'm sure that Dr. Don would agree, you get these little nagging things in the back of your head where you think, I didn't quite finish that. I didn't quite follow that through, and I wonder where that would go if I had 5 minutes to look back at it. This is an image that I encountered back in those days. which is emblematic of the kinds of things that I didn't really come to grips with. I'll tell you where this is from in a minute. This is a drawing made by an archaeologist slash painter named Don Beauregard in about 1910. Don Beauregard unfortunately died very young. He died of stomach cancer in 1915. So he was, and it was a great loss for a lot of people. But before he died, you'll see more of his work in a minute. He was working in the Southwest for Edgar Lee Hewitt at the Museum of New Mexico on various field projects. And when the people sat down to play cards, Beauregard would pick out his sketchbook and sketch it. This is a famous archaeologist named Neil Judd. Neil Judd, as a young man, and people may not know him, you necessarily need to know him, worked for the Smithsonian for many years, but I don't know. I can tell you who I think these guys are for a couple of reasons. I think I know who this is, but not really, and I don't really know her story. But in this group, she's fairly central. There were lots of women that were involved with these projects that Beauregard was working on with Edgar Lee Hewitt in the 1910s in New Mexico, but lots of them that I had not followed. And this guy, I've had no idea about this guy and the dog or the goat or whatever you got. I don't know about this guy. Well, so things bumping along the back of my head. So literally 8 or 9 months ago, I went to a conference. I was getting ready for a conference, a History of Archaeology conference. And I should say, I know we've got some Europeans here. The Europeans are much better at this than we are. I tend to go to European History of Archaeology meetings because there's all sorts of kinds of interesting things that they're doing that Americans, for complicated reasons, haven't quite gotten around to, which is maybe worth a conversation at some point. And the challenge that was presented in the call for papers for this conference was something that you saw in the archives that changed the direction of your research, which I thought was an innovative tack, because it emphasized this sort of tactile archive sense. One of the reasons why, again, I'm not a historian, not trained. I mean, historians would be embarrassed about me. I don't know who they are. I don't have but archaeologists have a certain set of skills that, provided that we want to or are motivated to, apply very nicely to archival work, and that's so we don't mind going through pieces of paper, thousands of them at a time, at the minutiae, to see, okay, what kind of pattern is going to show up here after I get to the end of the box, which bores a lot of people, doesn't bore us, or shouldn't, because we're used to looking at little potsherds by the million. So anyway, so I'm thinking, I want to know more about these people. I want to know these folks. Got this call for papers, and I could talk about that. That's sort of a tangent on this research, so we'll get to it maybe if we need to. And all of it, I went back to my own notes, and lots of people in those notes that I had not followed up on at all. And then I had a chance to go back to the same archives, these Edgar Lee Hewitt papers, which are in the Museum of New Mexico, and archives I had looked at in 1995, and I'd missed all this stuff. And in my own notes, it's like CX, CY, CG. And X, Y, and there's lots of stuff there. And most of it was about women. So in my own evaluation, I'm thinking, all right, where was I in 1995? And why did I miss this? And where were we, not we, but we, the academic world of the history of archaeology, why weren't we picking up on these stories? Or was it just me? Which it could have been. Is it the broader thing? I mean, but they're there. And there are people who do good work on sort of gender issues in the history of archaeology. So what was going on? Then these guys gave me the chance, this paper, to kind of go back into that, and I was galvanized quickly about what I'd missed. So that persuaded me to ramp up a project that I've been thinking about for a while, which is called the Mothers of American Archaeology, which, as it develops, hopefully will tell this story in a little bit of a different way. So, same story in some ways, different verse, but a much more interesting verse. Well, what am I doing about this? My strategy in my historical work always is to work from the archives. I don't tend to read things that got published. If you wrote an article or a book in 1920, I probably won't read it. I tend to do is say, okay, what correspondence from you exists? What memoranda covers your life? What did you do? Who did you talk to? And what did they say about you? Archaeologists are always calling me up and saying, hey, have you found the field notes for X project? And I always say, I'm not really looking at field notes because what I'm saying in my head is they're not there. Okay, they're not there. And if they were, they wouldn't tell me what I want to know. That's more of an archaeological history thing, right? And I'm thinking less about that and more about these stories about people who were around archaeology and created archaeology, but who are absent from the narrative, and in this case, mostly women. So ephemera are things that other things. They're brochures, they're maps, they are material objects. There are all kinds of things like that that are kept in our archives that they're interesting, but what do we do with them? Well, I ran into this in the collections of the Museum in New Mexico in December. That's a little sort of a cameo of Cora Whitford Hewitt, who was Edgar Lee Hewitt's first wife. We know almost nothing about Cora Whitford Hewitt, including we have no photographs of her. But going through the stuff in the back, there she is. And all of a sudden now I have a face for Cora Hewitt, and it starts to come a little bit into focus. I don't know where that's going to take me, but that's the kind of category of evidence, and you'll see some other examples of this kind of ephemera that is revealing in a lot of ways, but you wouldn't necessarily call it intellectual, which is one of the reasons why this stuff has been overlooked. I'm a real sucker for letterhead, so this is a letterhead for a company in, again, the 1910s that was focused on archaeological tourism in northern New Mexico. Cliff City's Pack Outfitters, I love this. Big game hunting, archaeological expeditions, and fishing trips, I mean, and that says a lot. It says a lot, and we'll see where these things go. So here's my favorite example in this kind of genre, and this is something that Elizabeth and I have been talking about a lot, which is this is actually courtesy of I've got a little margin. Don't worry about that. Courtesy of Don Beauregard in some cases. This one actually, this is a publication, not a publication. It was a camp newsletter for Edgar Lee Hewitt's archaeological field schools in northern New Mexico. They were based at this time in a place called Frijoles Canyon, which is in Bandelier National Monument, if you know that part of the world. And Beauregard, other people, sketched as they went. So there are a lot of women in the Frijoles Gazette that don't show up in the reports about it that I was reading for Bruins and Rivals when I wrote it. So I had known about it. It took us 5 years to find it. And I kept saying, I keep reading references that this Frijoles Gazette is in this archive, and they'd say, yeah, it'll turn up eventually, and it did. 5 years later, I said, yeah, we opened a box, and there was your Frijoles Gazette. There are children. There are, and this is there, in 1910 there were two women who were prominent in this kind of thing, and I love this for lots of reasons. There's a lot happening in this image. We're going to talk about one of them. I think this is the card player. That's Maud Roy, and this is someone we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. They're much more prominent there than they are in the published records. So that's that tells us a lot right there. So what I'm going to outline for you here is some, I guess I'd say, categories of unknown women that I'm working on. And of course, the word unknown, that's meant to be in quotes, right? I mean, of course, they're known to their family, and a lot of people. They're known a lot at the time. They're just not known to us in 21st century. And they have stories to tell, and collectively, they represent a rather significant body of stories for us today, and in a lot of ways, I think quite meaningful. We'll see. All right, so let's start here. I'm gonna have a sip of my. Chris might advise me not to be drinking a glass of wine and talking at the same time, but I still get to, well, yeah, you're sitting down. Cheers.
But you need fuel.
Yeah, but is this the kind of fuel? I mean, a little high octane. I don't know. Thanks, Don. Thanks. That's really what I need. Okay, so one category, I guess, where you would start, where you would come into this topic, is women in Southwest archaeology that accomplish things in the mainstream of the big, did what we think they were supposed to do. They go out and do projects and write things, but that for some reason we've lost track of. That's kind of an easy way to begin. The people that fell out of the folder for mysterious reasons. Karima could tell us more about this one. This is Bertha Parker Cody, who I know very little about, actually. There's actually a study about her that's coming out in this year that I'm looking forward to reading. Often credited as the first Native American female archaeologist. Now, whether that's true or not, I'm relying on other people's accounts for this. Remarkable person from upstate New York. Ends up in Southern California, does lots of interesting things, works for the Southwest Museum for a long period of time. Eventually gets married to Iron Eyes Cody, so it's Bertha Parker Cody, it's that Cody. But I would wager that very, very few archaeologists who work in Southern California know anything at all about Bertha Parker Cody. And that by itself, that's a gap. That's a gap in what we know and how we know it, and accounting for that gap, we could go in various different kinds of ways, right, with this. Did some interesting work in Nevada, all kinds of stuff coming out now about Bertha Parker, and she deserves it and more. So there are people in this category who you think, well, why don't we know more about her? Good question. This is someone that I spent more time on. This is the other woman in that sketch of the painting with the Friolous maidens. This is Barbara Frere-Marico, and this is her on the right. So this is the two women. That's Maud Woy and Barbara Frere-Marico. I found out recently that Frere-Marico sounds aristocratic, doesn't it? She's British. It's not. Her father decided he wanted to snap your name, and he'd been in Brazil. His last name was Frere, so he added Marico, and because he knew somebody in Brazil that had that name. So this is basically a self-made hyphenated name, just to sound. But all right, so remember this photograph. We're going to get back to this at some point. This is the 1910 Archaeological Field School in the Rito de los Frijoles in New Mexico, in Bandler National Monument as it is now. And that in the middle is Edgar Lee Hewitt. This is Neil Judd, who was in that sketch a while ago. This is Frederick Hodge, famous anthropologist of the day. This is H.B. Harrington. Lots going on in this room, in this image here. And here's Barbara Frere-Marico. Barbara Frere-Marico was the first woman to get a PhD in anthropology at Oxford. And I don't have a copy. There's a great photograph of her class, and there's 3 of them. And they're all kind of weird in their own weird way. And she's just standing there looking like, I'm not quite sure how I got involved with you guys. So we ought to know more about Barbara Frere-Marico. Published with them, did a lot of research. He was an ethnographer, really, did various kinds of things in northern New Mexico. So her publications come courtesy of the Bureau of American Ethnology, which anthropologists recognize these green binders with this logo from the era. Studies of ethnobotany. She spent time at Santa Clara Pueblo, did a whole study, went out to Hopi, went to the Grand Canyon, did a whole variety of things in 1912 and 13. I had the good fortune in November, actually when I went to this conference, I thought, aha, I'm here. I'm going to go running around little archives and do what I want. So I went to the Bodleian Library in Oxford and looked up Frere-Marico's correspondence with her Oxford supervisor, which is one of these letters. There's nothing in this that necessarily grabs us. It's just that, I'm here in New York, except what she mentions a lot of women in this letter. She meets Alice Fletcher, who was a famous woman anthropologist at that time. She talks about all the various women she's been recommended to that she's meeting as she comes to the United States on her way to the West to meet Edgar Lee Hewitt and to be trained as a field anthropologist. So there's a lot, actually, and I've barely started to parse this correspondence, but a lot of it is good. But she doesn't leave much of a track here in the U.S., and one reason why that happens is, of course, the First World War happens. So she doesn't come back. She comes in 1910 and then 1913, collects a lot of work. There's a lot of work and a lot of things. Goes back, and the war breaks out, and she never comes back to the United States. So she's writing to Hewitt, and this is about 1915. It's very kind of you to think of including me in your plans for the school, because she had been a sort of mainstay at this point. And I hope you will bear me in mind when the war is over, if I'm free to leave home again, my chief wish will be to work in New Mexico. Here she is in the 1911 Fearless Gazette. She must have drawn this. And this, by the way, I haven't even processed this image. This is the image I took in the library and was running around thinking, what should I show? What should I show? I remembered this and just clipped it out and put it. So here she is in England, thinking about her life back and the people that she knew back in New Mexico and wishing she could go back. She gets married. She drops out of anthropology entirely, although she stays in folklore. So she has a long sort of historical track record in folklore right into the 1970s. So she's had a very long life, but never comes back. And I think it's entirely circumstantial. That she was sort of primed to do these things, and the war broke out, and she gets married, and she's actually working for the intelligence during the war in some office in London. Again, interesting story. And there are a couple people who have tracked her story, but there are a lot more little nuances to it. And she's one of these people that we need to know more about. All right, so we're going to get farther off the track here. And I want to say something briefly about significant others. And this is a guy named Edgar Mearns, who's not actually an anthropologist, but he collected for anthropologists. And this is his wife and their child on the U.S.-Mexico border somewhere in 1890s. I don't know where they had this big cactus fence. I'm not even sure about that. This is an image from the Smithsonian. The very simple point here is that there's a huge support network that supports all these people that we like to talk about as archaeologists and doing what they do. And the role of spouses remains, I think, critically underexamined. Other fields do a little better at this. Historians of science are spending more time with this now. We're not. I think we need to. I mean, the Ethel Nelsons of the world deserve our attention for lots of reasons. The place where I've been working on this the most right now, and this is where it gets complicated, is with Charles Lummis. Lots of us in LA know a lot about Charles Lummis. I mean, he's Karima's predecessor and founding parent over there at the Autry. Lummis is complicated. I've been doing a lot of work with Lummis lately, and he gets more and more complicated all the time. He was married 3 different times. His wives play a really interesting role in his career. His first wife, who I don't have a photograph of, and I read a letter saying she destroyed everyone she could ever find. So, which is a great pity, because she's a remarkable individual. It'd be nice to be able to for a lot of ways. She was a medical student, was one of the first female doctors in Los Angeles, ran her own practice, did all kinds of things. Meanwhile, sort of supporting Charles Lummis emotionally and financially very early in his career, before he kind of became he was sort of in his showier days before he became this sort of more of a pillar of a certain kind of community. Lummis is not. He's not. Let's say this support is one way, right? The support is one way, and continues long after he's lost interest in her and gone off and developed relationships with other women. One of whom is his second wife, Eve Lummis here, who he meets in Isleta Pueblo, New Mexico. But I should say that Dorothea Moore, as she became known, after her divorce from Charles Lummis, was the wife of the first provost at UCLA, actually. Clement Moore. So Moore Hall is named after Clement Moore, who was, she worked in lots of philanthropies in a lot of kinds of ways. Wrote poetry, has an amazing book called Selvage, which is a book written in the 1920s of her poems, I think written back in the day, and lots of interesting things there about sort of childlessness and infidelity, which were basically the themes of her married life in many ways. Interesting story. Eve had a very similar experience with Lummis, but she was younger and less forthright, I would say. And so for a long time, he was definitely the dominant partner in that relationship. They had 4 children, one of whom died. This is basically between about early 1890s and then about they finally split in about 1909 and then got divorced a little later on. But she was the person that put meals on the table at El Alisal when various characters would show up in Lummis' life and say, hey, I've got to feed a big party here. She had to do that. She raised the children. This is her daughter Trebese, who's an interesting character on her own. But again, not a rocky relationship. Later on, she becomes a Spanish language translator and had her own career of her own with her second husband, whose name is Courtney DeKalb in Tucson. Another really strong individual, interesting, charismatic individual. I think that comes out in this photograph quite well. But someone who was intrinsic in all of the things that they did, and yet just sort of falls out of the narrative. Well, when I say significant others, I'm also talking about others who we're not married to. So Lillian Gildersleeve was a later secretary of Charles Lummis, with whom he had an affair, a long-running affair. And there was, well, actually, I shouldn't say long-running. And there's some heart-rending correspondence from Lillian Gildersleeve, basically saying, "Okay, marry me." And then the next letter is, "I'm packing my bags and I'm going," kind of thing. But she was also the one who typed all his letters and did all that kind of stuff at home. And when he's going around managed his household, she's also interesting enough. From both of these women were from New Mexico. So Lillian Gildersleeve grew up in Santa Fe. In fact, if you want one trivia, my middle school, my junior high, was on Gildersleeve Street in Santa Fe, named after her dad, right? So, this is very complicated. So, but the point is that we're not necessarily just talking about wives here, okay? There's another sort of complicated world, and this is a subject that historians of anthropology are very, very loath to get into. There are lots of interesting tales to be told there. And I actually had a long conversation with Lisa Posas, who's the librarian in the Braun Library at the Autry, and I said, I don't know about this story, and she was very supportive, which I appreciated. Promoting the idea that it's not going to hit. There are people who are not keen on these stories, but they're real, they're there. We need to be able to address some of them. So that's that. Well, this is just to add to that. This is a little bit of ephemera that this is just absolutely fabulous. Lummis kept track of everything, including these love letters from people that he was jilting, right? This is the seating chart at a party that he had on November 30th, 1913. There's a couple of things to say here. Here he is at the head of the table. He's divorced at this point, so Eve is not there to take her place at the bottom of the table, though she oftentimes didn't do it anyway, because I think she sort of didn't like the seating chart kind of scene here. But you can see, here's Elsa von Groff Penasco? I'm not quite sure how I would pronounce that. Who was a musician, her brother, another musician somewhere in here who was this guy, Julius, who was one of the violinists for the LA Orchestra at the time. Lots of things here, but they're also, in this case, young women at the table. One of whom here is Alice Connie. Alice Connie was the daughter of Adolf Bandelier's adopted daughter in New Mexico. Don't worry about that. But someone like Lillian Gildersleeve, someone that has come from this community in New Mexico to kind of hang out with Lummis, and maybe doesn't quite know what that might entail, and maybe your family doesn't know. We don't know. This woman here, Louise Miller, we have no idea about Louise Miller, except maybe she was a secretary for a period of time. The one that interests me is Elizabeth Duell, who I've written a whole paper about that I'm trying to get published, who basically came to the party to blow the whistle on Lummis. And what a place to be a fly on the wall, right? I don't think that she actually stood up at the table and said, "Okay, this is a den of iniquity." But she writes later that she says she talked to Alice, she talked to someone who I think is probably Louise Miller, and told them what was going on, and then they packed their bags and left. She says basically to his enduring hostility and contempt. Okay, and ponder that. I mean, this is a sort of a 30-year-old woman who walks into the house of this guy, who she needs. He's sort of a patron of hers in some ways, and she goes in there, blows the lid off this thing. A lot of courage, and her story is quite remarkable. Lots of things happening there. We don't talk about that stuff. We need to, and I'm working on some things with that. All right, audience and patronage. Who are the people that are supporting these archaeologists as they ramble around the West? Most of them are women. And this is not a specific lecture, but here you go. This is a lot of men there, but here and there in the front rows, women listening to these kinds of things. People like Edgar Lee Hewitt, people like Charles Lummis, the Western people that I see as really being central to archaeology in the Western states, survived on lectures. They're very convinced that public support was essential, and public support, of course, is coming from women in these kinds of cases. So a lot of ways to go with this, audiences, money, how that follows. So I'm going to just do a couple of things here. This is a report on a lecture that was given in Santa Fe. This is actually from the newspaper, Santa Fe New Mexican, and I'm spending a lot of time with newspapers reading the society columns in the newspapers, because that's where they're tracking these things. So they're reporting that the annual field program has started in August 1912. The lecture room in the historical palace of the governor was entirely filled with an enthusiastic audience of Santa Fe residents and students in the school who showed their appreciation for the splendid lecture that was given and the untold value and interest that this school of archaeology brings to Santa Fe. And the article goes on to talk about archaeology as an element of Western boosterism. They say, this is a resource of art. This is what we have this here. They say, we can't be a manufacturing center. We don't have any water. We can't do, but we've got archaeology. So, people get on board with this archaeology thing and start showing up to these lectures, and let's support this. And that shows up a lot in the things of this era. In fact, in my earlier book, Ruins and Arrival, I spent a lot of time talking about that populist thing. What I was, of course, missing was the role that women played in promoting that. And who should really point that out to me but my mother, who is here on the left, Georgia Snead. She lives in Santa Fe. I have a long, weird history in anthropology. My father was involved with museums. New Mexico is forgive me for a little tangent here. New Mexico is a very small state in terms of population. So it's the kind of place where if you wanted to walk into the governor's office and knock on the door, he might be there. I knew a friend of mine once wanted to play tennis on the governor's tennis courts, went up to the door, knocked on the door, and the governor comes out in a bathrobe and says, yeah, boys, go on, you can play tennis, and so it's that kind of place, right? So people, my father's an attorney, he ended up getting in a lot of things, including museums. And one of the things about him being involved with the Museum of New Mexico was that my mother got to join what's called the Women's Board of the Museum of New Mexico, which now mostly all they do is serve punch at the inauguration, right? That's their job. So then the governor gets inaugurated, the Women's Board of the Museum, and that's an interesting thing by itself, right? Goes out there and serves punch. But the Museum Board was established when New Mexico became a state at the same time as the Museum of New Mexico was established. And the Women's Board was Edgar Lee Hewitt's mechanism to gain access to the powerful men of the community. So by involving sort of the higher society women in those days with the museum, they were sort of his route to patronage. Of course, they oftentimes had money of their own and patronized it in that kind of way. So my mother basically said, you talk about the Women's Board in your work. And I said, no, actually, I don't. And she said, in her polite way, maybe you might want to do that. And this is a list of the women that were on the first Women's Board in the museum, and they're all, they're spouses of governors and past governors and mayors and leaders of business and all that kind of thing there. One thing that she did actually, and I give kudos to my mom, they got lists like this. They had lists of these people, and they didn't have their first names. So she said that when she was on the board, one of her projects was to find their first names and put them on there. I'm grateful to my mother, but you see how this is all playing out in all these kinds of complicated ways. Patronage, audience is all tied up in that, and it's something that archaeologists don't tend to think a lot about, which is a mistake, particularly in our history. All right, so education is another thing. All right, so this is the field school in Friolas Canyon, the summer field program in 1912. So if you remember the previous one I showed you of 1910 with Barbara Fair-Marico and all those luminary, Harrington and Judd and things, they're not here in this picture because Hewitt was engaged in a battle at this time over the soul of American archaeology. And he was much more of a populist. And what was the emerging sort of orthodoxy in American anthropology, academia, particularly sort of Harvard, Columbia in those days, Harvard, Berkeley, didn't like this angle, was much more interested in preparing future professionals. What that meant was that no longer, in a couple of years, no longer were they sending, young men to go out to New Mexico to be trained because they saw this as being kind of a dangerous, way to go, and it wasn't doing what they wanted to do. So by this, and Hewitt, in his own way, had sort of morphed this project entirely. So he's over here on the left. That's Edgar Lee Hewitt. This is Charles Lummis here. And I don't know how much you all know about Lummis, but he's got a cigar on. He's wearing a polka dot blindfold because he's blind, quote unquote, at that time. That's another interesting story here. This is Frank Springer, who's one of Hewitt's big patrons. Everybody else, they're all women. They're all women, and we know almost none of their names. Now, I think this is Elizabeth Duell here. Of course, Love is sitting next to her. I think that's kind of why that kind of got, I don't know. So she's, and I can put, I know some names who are in the room, but I don't know who's who here. What I do know is reading the newspapers from this era is lots of them are school teachers who then come up to this thing and they're going to go back to somewhere else in the Southwest to teach their schools. They come in to get sort of updated knowledge to take back to their classrooms. Hewitt came out of the normal school system, so some of the women are involved with that. Some of them are also society women who are coming out to the Southwest because they know about this, because the school is getting some publicity in national journals. There's a whole very, very interesting story here about who starts attending these meetings, these field sessions. They don't dig. They come in, other people dig and they watch them dig. They go to lectures, so they're not Mrs. Nelson, right? She's out there digging. They aren't doing that here in the school. But their story and the story of the role of sort of educators coming into these programs and getting this kind of knowledge and doing things with it, particularly in terms of the significance of archaeology to the American public, I think, at multiple levels, is a story that ought to be told here. I like, this is another group of people who are patrons of Hewitt's, the McPhee family. This is Maud McPhee in the middle here. Maud McPhee, and this is her dad, Judge McPhee, who was one of the boards on the board of the museum itself, and the rest of her family there. Maud McPhee is one of the first women to go to the New Mexico State University, the ag school, in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Goes down there, gets educated, marries an archaeologist, a historian archaeologist named Lansing Bloom, and is involved with all his projects for many years and has her own he writes pageants and history books and various kinds of things. Has a remarkable career. She attended all of these field programs for several years with Edgar Lee Hewitt. There were other women like Maud McPhee Bloom. Okay, also education, but this is another tangent entirely. There are many women who are going around the country on their own lecture tours talking to audiences about archaeology. And one of them I'm trying to get to know better, Frances Stanton Brewster. This is a brochure from one of her presentations, one of her lecture tours, where she would go and talk about the Inca, actually. She'd talk about Peru, about this sort of quasi-historical thing called Ollantay. And I know nothing about her. I know nothing about this thing, and maybe I don't know, Chris, if you know the story or not. But so she's basically a traveling lecturer going around the country, just like these archaeologists, like formerly Edgar Lee Hewitt and Lummis and people, talking about the ancient New World, or the indigenous New World, and this is sort of a colonial thing. She's got lantern slides, all sorts of things she does. We don't know anything about Frances Brewster. I've got now some correspondence from her, and she's talking to Hewitt. I'm thinking, okay, who else is she talking to? So then, and he actually tried to get her to be the art director of his exposition at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Diego in 1915. Doesn't work out. I don't know why, but there's something going on there. This is another educational force. Women teaching people about archaeology in that broad popular audience in New Mexico. Or in the West, particularly. Okay, so where this gets particularly, I think, important is, and this is my last of these categories today, so you're starting to slide back in your chair. I'm coming to a conclusion. Thanks very much. Preservation. Oh, wow, really? Nice. This is good, on time. I am firmly convinced that without the involvement of women on numerous levels in the field of historical preservation in the United States, it would never have happened. And this goes way back to the preservation in the 1850s of Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which buys Mount Vernon and runs it today. The Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities was run by women. In many ways, and forgive me for people who know this better than I do, so I'm just sort of working on this angle. It sort of rises out of all kinds of different women's movements, particularly in the West, the confederations of women's clubs, like the Abel Club in LA, lots of groups like this, the the Landmarks Club in LA that starts to save the missions gets hijacked by Lummis, but is originally started by female librarians in Los Angeles who want this kind of done. This is an image of, I'm going to talk about Mesa Verde for a few minutes because this is really where it takes on. This is an image of Mesa Verde in 1890, I would guess. And people in my business who like this is Richard Wetherell, who's a famous archaeologist, but I mean, I'm interested in them, right? I'm interested in who else was along on that. This is a tourist party. People went to the west, stayed at his ranch, and he ran them around the ruins, Cliff Palace and things like that. Okay, so the role of women in saving places like this is essential. There has been a bit of literature on this. What I'm particularly going to talk about for a few minutes here is a group called the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association. This is a book that was written about Mesa Verde and their role. But I should point out, it's a book written about the preservation of Mesa Verde for Mesa Verde. And my hunch is it doesn't get read very widely. Its circulation is relatively narrow. And where you do find this, and this is just the way that academic literature works, the regional publications sometimes drill down much more deeply into this because they're local and they're interested, whereas the larger scale ones kind of gloss over it for a variety of reasons. The Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association is established to save Mesa Verde. It's run by a woman named Virginia McClurg, who we're looking at here. That's Virginia McClurg, formidable individual. She was a reporter in the East, moved west, married Mr. McClurg, Gilbert McClurg, I think, and started getting motivated for a variety of causes, including preservation of indigenous ruins in the Southwest, particularly in her case Mesa Verde. It's a really interesting and really complicated story. Lots of tension at a variety of levels, a lot of lobbying going on. So she's writing, and she's got hundreds and hundreds of women in her organization who are writing letters and putting the pressure, in this case, on the Colorado legislative, the congressional representatives, making sure that they show up. This is in the same time period when the Antiquities Act, the 1906 Antiquities Act, is being debated. They play a major role in pursuing this and making this kind of thing happen. So this is their logo. Anybody read Latin? Dux femina facti. Anybody remember Latin? I don't. Yeah. It's the women shall lead. Okay. So the swastika is, because we use a lot of swastikas in those days. That's what's kind of interesting. And for those that don't, this is the Native American swastika rather than the other kind of swastika, right? Which is another reason they hate Nazis is they wrecked this symbol forever. But they're successful. Mesa Verde is, I think, the first national park to be declared. It's only 1907. But here's the thing that really interests me, and Karima knows a little bit about this. This was a national organization. So there was a Southern California chapter of the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association that was staffed by influential women in Los Angeles, basically. So, and one of the great unknown collections in the Autry is, actually in the Braun Library, are their papers. So here's an example from those papers. This is their letterhead here. So this is a California chapter of the Colorado Cliff Dwellings Association, and I throw this in there just because it's kind of sweet. It's a song. It's a song that someone wrote to be sung at these meetings. So it starts off, "Oh, students of the ancient cliffs, listen to the call." ... And you might think, well, kind of hokey and whatever, but they're engaged in this issue, and it's interesting to imagine women's groups in LA in 1904-05 banding together for the purpose of saving ancient Native American remains. Oftentimes elsewhere, but also maybe in Southern California, and in the Los Angeles Times, you can track lectures that some of these women gave locally here to various organizations to try to promote the cause. And they're around until they're around until the 30s, and some of the early donations to the Southwest Museum come from them. We don't know anything about them at all. And over the years, about 3 times I've gone, at some point seem a little sort of long ago and far away, but of course what I do now is I teach students. And by teaching students, I teach mostly young women. So, I mean, there are a few men scattered in this thing here. This is my students in my Anthropology 476A class 10 days ago at Solstice Canyon out here in the Santa Monica Mountains, going up there to check out tropical terrace at the top of that and talk about a lot of things. Most of you know that people go up there. That's a great hike. It's very busy. It's very popular. Go early, but it's a great introduction to the wilderness in this case. I'm thinking about them, and I'm thinking about how of all, and I'm in this, but of all the, we have a lot of women who teach anthropology at Cal State Northridge. All the archaeologists, there are 3 archaeologists and 1 woman, right? So in archaeology, the men are dominant in the faculty, right? Nowhere else, not out there in the private sector, not in the management sector, but in the faculty, and that tells us something. So I look at these women in my classes, and I'm thinking they're looking back at me, right? And where are we going with this, and where are they in this picture that I'm drawing for them? So one of my goals in doing this is not simply to talk about how we got here and how much more complicated that actually is than the story we tend to tell, but how these stories of these women in their much more complicated ways are actually a better match for the experiences of, I mean, how many of my students are going to be professional archaeologists? I mean, very, very few of them. We don't want them to do that. That's not necessarily the way, but our job is to educate them about this whole engagement between people in the past. And I see them more in this broader history, and I hope that they see themselves more in this history. That's why I think it's important. Thank you very much.